the weapon with which the fatal wound was inflicted, and even the position of the assailant. And the permanence of the body under other conditions is admirably shown in the case of Dr. Parkman of Boston, USA, in which identification was actually effected by means of remains collected from the ashes of a furnace." "Then we may take it," said Jervis, "that the world has not yet seen the last of John Bellingham." "I think we may regard that as almost a certainty," replied Thorndyke. "The only question, and a very important one, is as to when the reappearance may take place. It may be to-morrow, or it may be centuries hence, when all the issues involved have been forgotten." "Assuming," said I, "for the sake of argument, that Hurst did murder him, and that the body was concealed in the study at the time the search was made, how could it have been disposed of? If you had been in Hurst's place, how would you have gone to work?" Thorndyke smiled at the bluntness of my question. "You are asking me for an incriminating statement," said he, "delivered in the presence of a witness, too. But, as a matter of fact, there is no use in speculating a priori. We should have to reconstruct a purely imaginary situation, the circumstances of which are unknown to us, and we should almost certainly reconstruct it wrong. What we may fairly assume is that no reasonable person, no matter how immoral, would find himself in the position that you suggest. Murder is usually a crime of impulse, and the murderer a person of feeble self-control. Such persons are most unlikely to make elaborate and ingenious arrangements for the disposal of the bodies of their victims. Even the cold-blooded perpetrators of the most carefully planned murders appear, as I have said, to break down at this point. The most insuperable difficulty of getting rid of the human body is not appreciated until the murderer suddenly finds himself face to face with it. In the case you are suggesting, the choice would seem to lie between burial on the premises or dismemberment and dispersal of the fragments. And either method would be pretty certain to lead to discovery. "As illustrated by the remains of which you were speaking to Mr. Bellingham," Jervis remarked. "Exactly," Thorndyke answered, "though we could hardly imagine a reasonably intelligent criminal adopting a watercress bed as a hiding place." "No, that was certainly an error of judgment. By the way, I thought it best to say nothing while you were talking to Bellingham, but I noticed that, in discussing the possibility of those being the bones of his brother, you made no comment on the absence of the third finger of the left hand. I am sure you didn't overlook it, but isn't it a point of some importance?" "As to identification, under the present circumstances, I think not. If there were a man missing who had lost that finger, it would, of course, be an important fact, but I have not heard of any such man. Or again, if there were any evidence that the finger had been removed before death, it would be highly important. But there is no such evidence. It may have been cut off after death, and that is where the real significance of its absence lies." "I don't see quite what you mean," said Jervis. "I mean that, if there is no report of any missing man who had lost that particular finger, the probability is that the finger was removed after death, and then arises the interesting question of motive. Why should it have been removed? It could hardly have been detached accidentally. What do you suggest?" "Well," said Jervis, "it might have been a peculiar finger, a finger, for instance, with some characteristic deformity, such as an ankylosed joint, which would have been easy to identify." "Yes, but that explanation introduces the same difficulty. No person with a deformed or ankylosed finger has been reported as missing." Jervis puckered up his brows and looked at me. "I'm hanged if I see any other explanation," he said. "Do you, Berkeley?" I shook my head. "Don't forget which finger it is that is missing," said Thorndyke. "The third finger of the left hand." "Oh, I see," said Jervis. "The ring finger. You mean that it may have been removed for the sake of a ring that wouldn't come off." "Yes. It would not be the first instance of the kind. Fingers have been severed from dead hands, and even from living ones, for the sake of rings that were too tight to be drawn off. And the fact that it is the left hand supports the suggestion, for a ring that was inconveniently tight would be worn by preference on the left hand, as that is usually slightly smaller than the right. What is the matter, Berkeley?" A sudden light had burst upon me, and I suppose my countenance betrayed the fact. "I am a confounded fool!" I exclaimed. "Oh, don't say that," said Jervis. "Give your friends a chance." "I ought to have seen this long ago and told you about it. John Bellingham did wear a ring, and it was so tight that, when once he had got it on, he could never get it off again." "Do you happen to know on which hand he wore it?" Thorndyke asked. "Yes, it was on the left hand, because Miss Bellingham, who told me about it, said that he would never have been able to get the ring on at all but for the fact that his left hand was slightly smaller than his right." "There it is, then," said Thorndyke. "With this new fact in our possession, The absence of the finger furnishes the starting point of some very curious speculations." "As for instance?" said Jervis. "Ah, under the circumstances I must leave you to pursue those speculations independently. I am now acting for Mr. Bellingham." Jervis grinned and was silent for a while, refilling his pipe thoughtfully, but when he had got it alight he resumed. "To return to the question of the disappearance, you don't consider it highly improbable that Bellingham might have been murdered by Hurst?" "Oh, don't imagine I am making an accusation. I am considering the various probabilities merely in the abstract. The same reasoning applies to the Bellinghams. As to whether any of them did commit the murder, that is a question of personal character. I certainly do not suspect the Bellinghams after having seen them, and with regard to Hurst I know nothing, or at least very little, to his disadvantage." "Do you know anything?" asked Jervis. "Well," said Thorndyke, with some hesitation, "it seems a thought unkind to rake up the little details of a man's past, and yet it has to be done. I have, of course, made the usual routine inquiries concerning the parties to this affair, and this is what they have brought to light. Hurst, as you know, is a stockbroker, a man of good position and reputation. But about 10 years ago he seems to have committed an indiscretion, to put it mildly, which nearly got him into rather serious difficulties. He appears to have speculated rather heavily and considerably beyond his means, for when a sudden spasm of the markets upset his calculations, it turned out that he had been employing his client's capital and securities. For a time it looked as if there was going to be serious trouble. Then, quite unexpectedly, he managed to raise the necessary amount in some way and settle all claims. Whence he got the money has never been discovered to this day, which is a curious circumstance, seeing that the deficiency was rather over £5,000. But the important fact is that he did get it, and that he paid up all that he owed, so that he was only a potential defaulter, so to speak, and discreditable as the affair undoubtedly was, it does not seem to have any direct bearing on this present case." "No," Jervis agreed, "though it makes one consider his position with more attention than one would otherwise." "Undoubtedly," said Thorndyke. "A reckless gambler is a man whose conduct cannot be relied on. He is subject to vicissitudes of fortune which may force him into other kinds of wrongdoing. Many an embezzlement has been preceded by an unlucky plunge on the turf." "Assuming the responsibility for this disappearance to lie between Hurst and the Bellinghams," said I, with an uncomfortable gulp as I mentioned the names of my friends, "to which side does the balance of probability incline?" "To the side of Hurst, I should say, without doubt," replied Thorndyke. "The case stands thus. On the facts presented to us, Hurst appears to have had no motive for killing the deceased, as we will call him, but the man was seen to enter the house, was never seen to leave it, and was never again seen alive. Bellingham, on the other hand, had a motive, as he had believed himself to be the principal beneficiary under the will. But the deceased was not seen at his house, and there is no evidence that he went to the house or to the neighborhood, excepting the scarab that was found there. But the evidence of the scarab is vitiated by the fact that Hurst was present when it was picked up, and that it was found on a spot over which Hurst had passed only a few minutes previously. Until Hurst is cleared, it seems to me that the presence of the scarab proves nothing against the Bellinghams." "Then your opinions on the case," said I, "are based entirely on the facts that have been made public?" "Yes, mainly. I do not necessarily accept those facts just as they are presented, and I may have certain views of my own on the case. But if I have, I do not feel in a position to discuss them. For the present, discussion has to be limited to the facts and inferences offered by the parties concerned." "There!" exclaimed Jervis, rising to knock his pipe out. "That is where Thorndyke has you. He lets you think you're in the thick of the know until one fine morning you wake up and discover that you have only been a gaping outsider, and then you are mightily astonished, and so are the other side, too, for that matter. But we must really be off now, mustn't we, Reverend Senior?" "I suppose we must," replied Thorndyke, and as he drew on his gloves he asked, "Have you heard from Barnard lately?" "Oh, yes," I answered. "I wrote to him at Smyrna to say that the practice was flourishing, and that I was quite happy and contented, and that he might stay away as long as he liked. He writes by return that he will prolong his holiday if an opportunity offers, but will let me know later." "Gad!" said Jervis, "it was a stroke of luck for Barnard that Bellingham happened to have such a magnificent daughter. There, don't mind me, old man. You go in and win. She's worth it, isn't she, Thorndyke?" "Miss Bellingham's a very charming young lady," replied Thorndyke. "I am most favorably impressed by both the father and the daughter, and I only trust that we may be able to be of some service to them." With this sedate little speech, Thorndyke shook my hand, and I watched my two friends go on their way until their fading shapes were swallowed up in the darkness of Fetter Lane. End of chapter